one of the things that we throw around a lot in Western culture is the notion of disruption, move fast and break things. Like a lot of the tech companies have that philosophy. And I'm increasingly interested in harmony, and I'm increasingly interested in continuity. And I think a society that's constantly moving fast and breaking things, and a society that is constantly disrupting, is actually having such damaging effects on all of us, because there is, to Eastern philosophy, a wisdom to creating a harmonious environment and creating continuity from generation to generation, or from institutional stability. Because I think one of the things the pandemic really revealed to us about the arts is how fragile things can be when they're disrupted, and the devastating effect it's had on all of our mental health from, the constant flux and disruption of our lives. And so that's something else I'm thinking about with Creative Capital, is how do we build on our legacy of supporting artists? How do we innovate in a harmonious way that's in line with our mission, that's in line with serving artists, and isn't constantly like breaking things and starting afresh? Because I think that can be really disruptive to artists.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. This is your host, Yoshino, and welcome to another exciting episode of Artists Decoded. My guest for today is Christine Kuan, who is the president and executive director of Creative Capital. Kuan was also the CEO and director of Sotheby's Institute of Art. She also held roles as chief curator and director of strategic partnerships at Artsy. A little bit about Creative Capital. It is a nonprofit grant-making organization that funds projects within the visual arts, performing arts, film, music, technology, literature, and basically any sort of medium in between. They were founded in 1999 as an independent nonprofit in resistance to censorship when the NEA discontinued most of its grants to individual artists following controversies with Robert Mapplethorpe and other artists of the time. Each year, Creative Capital funds 50 projects with funds up to $50,000 in grant funding per project. And something really interesting about them, but for every dollar that they raise, 83% of the funds goes directly to artists and grants and projects that they are working on. They are also focused on diversity within the arts. And in the past 5 years, Creative Capital has funded more than 75% artists of color. So to dive in a bit to the conversation with me and Christine, I found that Christine was just a very kind person, and you can really tell that within this conversation that she deeply, deeply cares about artists. She loves the independence that artists have and the idea of being able to question things that most other people would not within other disciplines. We also talk about the selection process of how Creative Capital selects artists and how artists can apply to Creative Capital. And I really enjoyed the candor of this episode, and Christine was very encouraging of artists to pursue their personal projects and to really dive into things that artists are really passionate about and to really focus on that. And I found that to be quite encouraging for myself being an artist, but I think that that will really translate well for everyone out there that is listening to this podcast. Before we begin, please go to our Spotify page and or iTunes page to leave us a review. If you go to the Spotify page, you can simply click on that 5-star, leave it at that. It only takes about a second, and I would greatly appreciate it so that more people can find out about this podcast. So here it is, my interview with Christine Kuan, who is the president and executive director of Creative Capital. Hope you enjoy it. Thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate you and your time.
Thanks, Yoshino. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, definitely.
Really nice talking to you.
Definitely nice talking to you. Yeah. And so I was reading an article that you wrote, and you picked 3 quotes before the article, and one was by James Baldwin. And I'm going to read you the quote to start off the conversation, because I felt like this was picked with intention.
Okay.
Okay, so societies never know it, but the war of an artist with his society is a lover's war, and he does at his best what lovers do, which is to reveal the beloved to himself, and with that revelation to make freedom real. And I'm curious, why did you pick that quote?
I think for many reasons. That quote is about many things. Obviously, at Creative Capital, I support individual artists, but we're also here to support risk takers and freedom of expression. And so this quote is really about what it means to critique and to take risks and to push boundaries in America. And I think we're in a moment culturally in this country where freedom of expression and individual agency is under attack. And a lot of people see that by being an artist, being a risk taker, a rebel, you're somehow anti-America or anti-patriot, Mm-hmm. And I think what really an artist is doing is out of love. And I think artists really are pushing boundaries because they understand deeply about what they're seeing. And to support that vision is helping America become more of itself, which is the freest country in the world. So I think there's something about what James Baldwin sees as an American writer, as an artist, that is really pertinent to our times, which is why I chose that quote.
No, I like that. I like that. So what is it about, like, specifically, because that you like about risk taking and freedom of expression, and what is it that draws you to those ideas in particular?
I don't know if it's inborn in me. So my grandfather was an artist.
What sort of artist?
He was a painter and a poet, and also really an advocate for freedom from China. And I think it's genetic. So I don't know. But I always grew up wanting to be very independent and wanting to be free. So I was always, even in elementary school, I would always just sort of be unconcerned with convention, unconcerned with following the status quo. And what I like about Creative Capital and I like about artists is they're unconcerned about what the norm is. Mm-hmm. You really have to be able to look at art, look at a situation and say, how could I do it differently? How can we look at society differently? How can we look at all of the social issues that this country is facing, or even global issues that people are facing, and come at it from a different perspective? So I find the arts the most freeing of all the disciplines.
Yeah.
And I think Angela Merkel said something really interesting. She said something about science, because she's a physicist, that the closer you get to science, the closer you get to God. And I'm paraphrasing there, but that understanding the miracles of science and what's happening in the universe really makes you understand the mystery of all of this. And I think artists are that other side of science, where there's a lot of mystery in why music and dance and painting moves us. It's not, a clinical answer to understanding what makes artists great or what makes them interesting. But there's something mysterious and powerful about that. So that's very attractive to me.
Yeah. Would you consider yourself an intuitive person?
Maybe. I don't know. What does that mean?
Well, I think for me, at least, the way I interpret the word intuition is that it's a muscle that one practices and one chooses to practice and internalize and to follow their gut as to what is right for them, as opposed to structurally in society what seems to be a right path. So something that is more, how do I say, more like of the heart and more of like a personal attraction to something.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely that. I think I had a boss once in my career who hired me. He said because I had good instincts, judgment, and I was resourceful. And so I think the instincts, I have a really great knack for finding opportunity where other people don't see it. And so I'm always, one of my first jobs was at the Metropolitan Museum. And, my parents were like, why would you ever leave the Metropolitan Museum? It's the most fabulous museum on earth. But from there, I went on to Oxford University Press because I thought there was this new opportunity. And from there, I keep changing into all these different roles. And one of the roles I had was at Artsy. And I was one of the early sort of people there when it was still in beta. And people were like, that's crazy. Why would you leave the Mellon Foundation Artstor, this known organization, to this like unknown startup? And so I think instinctually I knew that something big was about to happen and something interesting was about to happen. And so I think that's also part of the risk taking, is taking that risk to move from something that's conventionally understood as being successful or large or influential and going to something that has potential.
Totally. And it's also, I think, very important, especially when you're in a position with a company or, like you're living those days and those hours, right? And so when other people have their opinion on what you should do, they aren't doing the things that you're actually doing on a day-to-day basis, right? So I think like sometimes these projections, which they are, that other people have upon your decisions in life, like you can really only take it with, a grain of salt, right? Because I think like at the end of the day, if you trust your intuition, then you will know what to do because, you're living it, right? That's the way I think about it.
I totally agree with you. And I was recently at a gala to support the Brooklyn Academy of Music, BAM. Mm-hmm. And Spike Lee got up and spoke about how he was so fortunate that he had parents who never told him he couldn't be a filmmaker, parents who supported his ideas of being an artist. And he said, so many parents, quash their children's dreams because they say, there's no pathway there. And I think there's pathways for everybody in every discipline, in every, kind of work. And there's no such thing as here's the formula to life.
Totally.
So I think you're absolutely right. Like you have to follow your instincts. You've got to be able to take risks and experiment because nobody has the answer for your life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think too, that's what's really cool about Creative Capital is that you foster all different types of disciplines. It's a interdisciplinary, venture, right? And so I think the interesting thing about that is at the end of the day, it's really ideas and mediums that people utilize or artists utilize to be able to create something, right? So that medium can be in virtual reality, it can be in painting, it can be in, photography or whatever, And I think sometimes, I'm curious what you think, because for me, I think it's this sort of institutionalized learning structure, stemming from, and I'm making kind of broad generalizations, but from staying in one discipline, you have to choose painting, you have to stick with that. And I'm curious, what your take is on that in terms of being able to be an artist and use multiple disciplines in order to convey an idea.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think it's amazing that you understand creative capital so well immediately, because it really is about ideas. And artists are really pushing boundaries on the idea first. And then we really look at how they deliver on that idea or execute on that idea. And the discipline is only part of that idea. And many of the artists today, contemporary artists, are multidisciplinary in what they create. I just saw Gibbs Cameron's Pioneer Works performance of Titanic Depression, which is a project that Creative Capital helped to fund. And it's performance, it's video, it's sound, it's, costumes, it's all kinds of things. And so a lot of the artists that we fund work across disciplines, and they're talented in all those different media, right? So Titus Kaphar, a very well-known painter, we funded his Jerome project, which is a painting project. But Titus has also made a lot of films that have screened at the Tribeca Film Festival and other places. And so a lot of these artists are capable of taking their idea and bringing it to life in a variety of media.
Yeah.
And I think that's how contemporary artists work.
Mm-hmm. And when you first joined the Creative Capital team, what attracted you to Creative Capital? Was it the diversity? Was it because I have some figures here. So in the 2022 cohort, 90% of grantees identify as Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Latinx. 57% of women, gender nonconforming, non-binary, and undisclosed. And 7% identify as having disabilities. And in the past 5 years, Creative Capital has funded more than 75% of artists of color. And another thing that I found that is really interesting and amazing that you all disclose is that 83% of the funds that you receive goes to the artists and the grants and services. And so I think it's very important to be able to disclose all that information, and then also because it also shows the intention of the organization as a whole. And I guess going back to my initial question, like, what attracted you to Creative Capital when you first joined?
I think the most important thing about Creative Capital is our intimacy with the artists. And what attracted me to Creative Capital was that our mission is to serve individual artists. And I've spent over 25 years working in the arts in New York City at very large and prestigious institutions, which I love. I still love and support all arts organizations, but I worked at the Metropolitan Museum. I mentioned Artsy. Recently, I was CEO of Sotheby's Institute, all great organizations. But in a lot of these organizations, when you work there, you don't actually come in contact with any artists. Or if you do, they come in and give a guest lecture or something like that. But you're not really personally working with the artists for many of these roles. And what was exciting about Creative Capital to me is that we are working with individual artists not only on one thing, like let's say 3 months out of the year or something like that, but once we give a grant to a Creative Capital artist, it's really a lifelong relationship. So we have grantees from the first cohort, like year 2000, where they will still call us and be like, hey, I need a lawyer. I'm in a pickle with like this communications thing. Do you have a marketing person I can talk to? We have people who have a tax question who will come from, many years back and say, hey, I need somebody to help me with this. So it's really, it's a lifelong relationship with the artist. It's a meaningful relationship with the artist. And I would say it's a genuine relationship. We are not a presenting organization. We don't need the artist to produce something for us. We're just here to serve the artist. So it's really different than saying like, hey, I need the exhibition to look a certain way, or I need this performance to bring in X number of audience members. We don't need the artist to deliver for us. So we're just in a relationship to serve and benefit the artist. That's very exciting because so much of the art world, it's not about service to the artists.
Yeah. Which is interesting.
Yeah, which
right?
is very interesting.
Yeah. And that's what I found to be really interesting, like that the services that you provide the artists, like tax services to just like consultations on their project to, I don't know, whatever it may be, right? And like, I've never heard of an arts organization doing that, for the artists. And I found that to be like really special and very interesting, because of the amount of intimacy and support that you all give to the artists. And speaking of an artist in particular, so I started boxing over in this place called Outbox, which is in Brooklyn. And I met one of your artists that received the funds, Castles.
Oh, Castles is amazing.
Yeah.
They're amazing.
Mm-hmm. And I was scrolling through your Instagram and I saw a photo of you two, and and then I went on a deep dive into their work, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is amazing.
We are often the first to fund some of these artists. We're also the first sometimes to fund an idea that later on larger organizations will get behind. And it's really an incredible relationship because, for your example with Castles, that's many, many years back. But these artists, because of the relationship they have with the organization, they care about meeting the new president. So I'm only 2 years in.
Yeah.
A lot of organizations, it's totally irrelevant who's running the organization, right? But for Creative Capital, the artists really care. And I think that's because they know we are only here to support artists. We don't have any other agenda.
Yeah.
And so it's I think they understand that this is not an extractive relationship.
Totally.
Yeah.
Because I believe Castles won that grant in 2015.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That's interesting. Right now, what is the grant cycle called Wild Futures right now?
Yes. So we opened a grant cycle a year ago called Wild Futures, and it was for performing arts, tech, and lit. And then this year, we just opened and closed the visual arts and film Wild Futures cycle. So in total, all the disciplines, artists were invited to apply. And to be clear, I want to say it's not saying that the artist is only a filmmaker or only a dancer. We're saying to the artist, who do you want to review your idea for your project? Do you want people who are experts in dance to look at your project, or do you want people who are experts in film to look at your project? So cool. It's really about the artist telling us this project needs to be looked at by reviewers who have expertise in X, Y, and Z. Yeah. And so that's a way for us to really hone in on what's happening across the country, and also what are the new ideas that are bubbling up, and bringing people. Part of this open call national grant making process that's interesting, which I learned from being on this job, is that we're feeding the whole ecosystem of cultural producers in this country, because we bring in hundreds of reviewers from all over the country to review what the artists submit. So someone might say, okay, this is a really cool project. It's not quite Creative Capital, but it would be perfect for this person who's doing X in Oklahoma. Or there's this other project I know about in Hawaii that would be perfect for that. So people are seeing the ideas percolate before these ideas become real. And that's really exciting. And for us, what we're trying to do is pull out the projects that are risk-taking, that are new ideas, original ideas, and put some funding behind it so that other people will get on board and say, okay, this is super interesting. I want to fund this.
Yeah. I mean, which makes sense because like psychologically, like even if you think about startups, let's say an artist is kind of like a startup. Whenever a startup gets their first round of funding and they have that first investor, generally it starts momentum for other investors and people to become interested with that startup. So
that's exactly right. Yeah. So that's the whole concept behind it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's just like these certain like human psychological traits, I think, permeate into other fields. Right. And so I think like, I'm curious, like what are some of the projects that, I don't know. Can you describe like a couple of projects that you've worked on recently that like really stand out to you? Not saying that you have favorites or anything, but just something that comes to mind immediately.
Yeah, there's a few that I really was moved by when I read about them and when I saw the artists speak about them. One is Jordan Weber, who is an environmental artist and multimedia artist. We funded his project for MX. MX stands for Malcolm X. It is a soil remediation and planting project in Malcolm X's hometown of Omaha, Nebraska. And the soil was all, contaminated by lead smelting. And so this project that Creative Capital is helping to fund is helping build a greenhouse in this space using indigenous plants and all kinds of new sort of agricultural techniques to remediate the soil. And he's doing projects all over the country. And actually, he just opened an exhibition at the Venice Architecture Biennial.
Wow,
so
that's amazing.
He's incredible. And he's now in New York, but he's originally from Iowa. Mm-hmm. Another artist is Jesse Crimes that probably a lot of people have heard of. And Jesse Crimes is a formerly incarcerated artist. He started his own nonprofit recently to give back to formerly incarcerated artists. But we are funding his mass incarceration quilt series. And he's working with different prison systems and incarcerated individuals with clothing to make new quilts that he's designing, and they're absolutely stunning. And one of them was recently in the Ford Foundation Gallery, so people can see his work. But he's a rising star.
Wow, yeah, and that's cool. Like, I mean, I don't know what these quilts look like, although I did read a little bit about both of those artists. But I would imagine that also challenges in a way the perspective of gender appropriateness in terms of like quilt making, you know what I mean? And also like, I would imagine that could be a very intimate process for these, it's formerly incarcerated people that are working on these quilts, right?
It's a range of people. He also has studio assistants and various collaborators. But it's an incredible series, and there's a lot of other projects. You know, those are two artists that I think are really incredible. I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the early projects that we funded that are really amazing. And one of the artists that you probably have heard of is Lynn Hershman Leeson, who's based in San Francisco. She's in her 80s. She had a new museum solo show a couple years back. She was in the Venice Biennial Milk of Dreams last year. And she is a 2008 Creative Capital grantee. And I recently had the pleasure of meeting her in person in San Francisco in January. And she's in her 80s. She's really a pioneer in so many ways. Creative Capital funded her film, Women Art Revolution, which is a documentary film about some of the most radical feminist artists working in America. And the film is so important art historically. It's in the Stanford archives. So what I like about Creative Capital's project funding model, because we're trying to put new work out there, help artists realize new work, is that something like that, Women Art Revolution, contributes to the whole field of art history, because this is a documentary about women artists who, as we all know, are very often left out of art history. So it's putting funding around projects that really can not only change an artist's life, but can change the whole field or the discourse around a field. And so I'm excited about that particular story because Lynn said Creative Capital was the first organization to give her a major grant.
Wow.
And so we like to identify, discover, and help artists realize things that are really ambitious and adventurous, particularly where the market or institutions maybe have not yet caught up to where the artist is.
Yeah. That's interesting that like some of these interests seem to have converged for you with your position over at Sotheby's Art Institute. And how, I mean, I was watching a video and you were talking about women in the arts, and I think you were, I forget what news organization.
You've really done a lot of research.
I did a little bit of research.
I'm impressed.
but I
don't even know what this video is. Yeah.
Well, it's on YouTube for anyone who wants to watch it. But anyways, it was about, women in the arts. And I mean, just you telling me about that project in particular, that 2009 project. And it was basically just talking about like women in the arts and just the inequality of women in the arts as opposed to like men. And anyways, that is just what the video was about.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But it seems like that kind of like a lot of these interests are kind of like organically and holistically like coming together. Would you say that maybe?
Yeah, I think that.
Yeah.
I think it's also, I mean, one thing, Yoshino, that you and I are doing, I think right now is we have the luxury of talking about art and we have the luxury of doing what we want to do with our time.
Yeah.
And I think one of the great things about working in the arts is you're constantly surrounded by inspiration. You're constantly surrounded by new ideas. And that's very invigorating. So it also coincides with what we're talking about, women, social justice issues. A lot of the ideas that this country's currently grappling with or has been grappling with for 250 years is really able to be exercised in the arts in a very freeing way. And you can really explore new ideas with artists in a way that you can't really do in like banking or like medicine.
Yeah.
And I was pre-med. So,
you were?
Yeah, I was pre-med like many Asian students. And it just didn't feel like it was very part of my nature. I think it's just too clinical for me. I like things to be more loose, I think.
But you're
Yeah.
Oh, but you're also a poet and a writer too, is that right?
Yeah, so I have my MFA from a graduate program called the Iowa Writers Workshop, and I have my degree in creative writing poetry.
Yeah.
Which is quite funny because when I was right out of college, I worked in New York for 2 years at an antiques gallery.
Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
And I was debating whether to get my MBA in business or to get my MFA in creative writing poetry. And I had a friend who said, well, you're never going to get in to the Iowa Writers Workshop, so you might as well apply and then you can go get your MBA knowing that you've tried, and then you can just put it to rest. And so I applied and I got in. And so I never did my MBA.
How you feel about that in hindsight?
I feel really happy about it. And I think for anybody who's listening, who's thinking about pursuing the arts, I mean, the arts is a great way to make a living. And I know plenty of people who have MBAs who don't make as much as me. And I know people who make more than me. And I think it's the same thing in the arts. I mean, I don't think there's like a set salary. There are plenty of people in film and TV and other industries making plenty of money. And there's plenty of people who don't make any money. But that's true of lawyers. That's true of doctors. That's true of anybody.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Well, also, if you think about the process of becoming a lawyer, I mean, you have to kind of like factor in the amount of debt that you're going to be under, if you go that route too. So it's like, I think there's a lot of variables within the whole process of becoming whatever it is that you want to become, which I think should take a lot of careful consideration and intention. And I think that a lot of the times we allow other people's projections, like that we were talking before, I think before we recorded, right, to permeate our consciousness. And those projections from people that are of great influence of us, we, at the end of the day, I think we have the option to let them have a stronghold on us or not, right?
Right.
But I think because we're such social creatures, we don't want to let, let's say, our parents down or our spouse or loved ones down. And I think that those social pressures can really be difficult to deal with.
Yeah, I think they're very difficult, and I think the realities of living in a capitalist society, you have to have a strategy for paying your bills and having health care and all that. And I think that is the big challenge of working in a lot of the industries that are not, your typical industries for job security.
Totally.
But I think, the other thing we're seeing with AI and technology is that some of these traditionally, I think there was an article that just came out that like ChatGPT did better at stock picking than, an actual stockbroker. So it's, I don't know how secure a lot of these things are as technology evolves. So, yeah.
That's fascinating and terrifying.
Right. Yes, absolutely
the
terrifying.
Amount of change,
Yes, yeah.
I think is really, it's really interesting.
I think that is a great segue to mention that I really believe in human connection. And I think increasingly with social media, and I'm addicted to Instagram like everybody else, but it's really important to meet with people face to face. And one of the challenges of starting this job during the pandemic was my first year of conversations with artists was predominantly by Zoom. And when you meet people in person, they reveal and talk about a lot more of what they need from the organization than they would on Zoom. And I think for anybody, the human connection is really precious. And I think people have to really invest in that and not just resort to texting or email. Because even I think sitting here having this conversation with you, I think it would have been different if we did it on Zoom or if we did it.
It totally would have.
Yeah.
It totally would have. Because, there's just so many different elements, like staring into a screen as opposed to looking someone, in the eyes and being able to like see people, the way that people carry themselves and like hand gestures and things like that. And also, I'm a great believer of energies, being able to feel like the energy of people. And I think like going back to the intuition conversation, like I feel like we know if someone is giving off a bad energy, and sometimes we listen to it, or if we don't, or we know if someone immediately has a good energy to them, right? So I think like it's important to be able to be observant of those things. And I think that interfacing with a computer can limit a lot of that shared connection and energy.
I agree. And I was talking to a friend about this, and I was like, well, we wouldn't ever assume like to put an elephant in front of a screen and be like, it's good, like they're all set, they can, Zoom with another elephant. Like that's obviously not going to satisfy what a creature needs. And I think we're all, we all have these biologies that need other types of interaction that a screen doesn't provide. But I also think what you're talking about in terms of energies, as I get older, I feel one of the things that we throw around a lot in Western culture is the notion of disruption, move fast and break things. Like a lot of the tech companies have that philosophy. And I'm increasingly interested in harmony, and I'm increasingly interested in continuity. And I think a society that's constantly moving fast and breaking things, and a society that is constantly disrupting, is actually having such damaging effects on all of us, because there is, to Eastern philosophy, a wisdom to creating a harmonious environment and creating continuity from generation to generation, or from like institutional stability. Because I think one of the things the pandemic really revealed to us about the arts is how fragile things can be when they're disrupted, and the devastating effect it's had on all of our mental health from, the constant flux and disruption of our lives. And so that's something else I'm thinking about with creative capital is how do we build on our legacy of supporting artists? How do we innovate in a harmonious way that's in line with our mission, that's in line with serving artists, and isn't constantly like breaking things and starting afresh? Because I think that can be really disruptive to artists.
Yeah, definitely. And that makes sense, that idea that you're talking about, like, I was listening to you on a podcast and I think it was with Yale Radio, and you were talking about, the interviewer at the end asked you about books that you're into. I mean, this was 2021, but you said Deep Work by Cal Newport.
Yes.
And to be fair, I haven't read the book, but I understand what the idea is about. And it's, essentially focusing on one thing and doing the deep work in that one particular thing. I mean, that's, I think, why people like running. That's why people like writing, certain things that like you can invest your time into that you feel isn't like wasted time.
Right.
Right.
It's really, we were talking before we started recording about, about travel and about time and extending time. And there's something about screen time that is just kind of wasted time. And I've spent a lot of time sending emails, as probably everybody has, and doing a lot of like social media stuff and texting. But none of that measures up to my memories and experiences of traveling and meeting people and experiencing things in person. So I do think like we need to create time. We need to create time for ourselves. And I think quality time is also doing nothing. I mean, there's such a worship of busyness in American culture that I think is also detrimental to our health. And we just can't always be busy. It's just not, it's not normal actually to be like running around constantly. So, and we're all overbooked. True. I mean, I think that's another issue that we're facing. Yeah.
It's interesting about thinking of the idea of being overbooked. So for some reason, the Instagram algorithm has targeted me for this AI productivity app that I keep on seeing.
My God.
And I'm like, okay, so the idea is that if you have gaps in your schedule, it fills it up with things that you should be doing.
That is so funny.
Based on this AI productivity app.
It's like a nightmare.
Yeah, I'm like, get me out of here. What is this? What is this tool about? This so-called tool about? And yeah, I think it's just like, when in the Industrial Revolution, when the 9-to-5 work schedule became integrated into work culture, there was like a revolt from a majority of the public. They're like, I don't want to work 9 to 5. Right. Like, this is ridiculous. And now, going, I was watching this video because everyone gets their information on YouTube, and I think it was by Vox, and it was talking about the Chinese corporate work culture, which is called 996.
Right. I've seen that video. I think
you saw that video.
Yes. It's insane.
I was like, no, there's no way that anyone could pay me any amount of money to go to do that. It's just, I don't know. I just find it fascinating and kind of and sad that, I think that, but I also understand, like people's, I have empathy towards it, because, once it becomes part of the culture, going back to speaking about, how we're all social creatures, that it becomes normalized,
right?
And I'm curious what you think about that in terms of having like a work-life balance.
Well, I'm terrible because I don't have a work-life balance. I just work all the time. But that's not, I recognize it's not good. But I think I'm working on balancing. And part of it is you have to respect yourself enough to say, I deserve time off and I deserve downtime. But also I'll be more productive if I rest and recuperate and actually come to everything with my full energy rather than just like working yourself to the bone. I'm sort of like a workaholic, but I'm also an obsessive person. So I really like to think about something until it can't be thought of anymore. And I'll work on something until I've completely exhausted it. And that is also like when I was in grad school for poetry, like I would just write for 3 days and I wouldn't leave my apartment. I would just work on a poem or whatever I was doing because I just get into the zone and I'm in it. So I just think it's healthy for people to disconnect and rest and reconnect with nature. I think, there's so many studies about how damaging it is that we're so disconnected from nature. And I think how sad it is that you have to have money to connect with nature when we're all from nature, and now it's just like a privilege to go to the beach or whatever. And that's absurd actually, because we're all from nature.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think it's interesting how like these modern quote unquote conveniences turn out to be inconveniences if you want. Like you were saying, if you want to reconnect with nature, it has to be time that you put aside as opposed to like part of one's daily life, unless you choose that life,
Exactly.
And so, gosh, I had a really good question. I totally it just went into the ether. Okay, so I'm gonna get a little spiritual on you. So, like, have you ever read the Kabbalion?
No.
So it's essentially this like the Greek and Egyptian ancient teachings, and it speaks about like vibrations and how we are all like shared vibrational energy. And would you consider yourself a spiritual person?
I don't think I'm very spiritual.
No, you wouldn't?
No, I don't.
No,
but maybe I'm a hidden. I don't know. Maybe, but I don't think of myself as a spiritual person. But I think I'm very. I'm getting there. Yeah. And I think I'm very interested in, we were talking about nature. I'm very interested in the environment and what capitalism is doing to the environment. I'm interested in, I'm personally, like I compost. We try to be low waste. We don't try to use, we don't use single-use plastic. We try to do all these things that are low waste, zero waste.
Yeah.
And I was very happy during the pandemic because I never flew anywhere. And so my carbon footprint was next to nothing. I've never owned a car.
Oh, wow.
I don't know. I'm a natural sort of low waste kind of person. And I think what's happening to this planet and the indifference people have to destroying our home is really scary. The fact that people are just, and the green energy, the greenwashing and the cobalt mines and the lithium mines and what we're doing to destroy nature and different communities, indigenous communities, is really scary. And so I think that is probably going to lead me to spirituality.
No, I understand that. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. I think I remember what I was going to ask. So do you still have a writing practice? Like, do you write?
I really don't have time, and I really want to get back to writing.
Yeah.
But I think I would have to pull back a little bit from the office.
Yeah. I understand that.
Yeah.
I understand that. So there's a project called the Healing Project that you all worked on, and I'm going to be interviewing
Samora Pinderhughes.
Yes, on Tuesday. And how did that come about, in terms of funding that project, but also, I don't know, I guess what was your take on the project?
Samora is an amazing artist. We're really thrilled to support the Healing Project.
Yeah.
That project was selected before I joined Creative Capital. But it is very much in the vein of what and the ethos of what Creative Capital supports. It's a music multimedia project related to incarcerated individuals, and it's a healing project. So what's incredible, and I saw Samora perform the Healing Project at Carnegie Hall, and He's performing all over the country. He's terrific. And I think one thing to talk about with Creative Capital is the way we select projects. It's not what I think or what my staff thinks. We bring in experts from all over the country, and it's an open call, so any artist can apply. Mm-hmm. And the reviewers review the ideas. And we bring in music people, we bring in theater people, dance, visual art, film, etc. And the project came out of a process of a number of experts saying, this is one of the most exciting new ideas that we're seeing. And so that's how an artist gets a Creative Capital Award.
Wow.
So what's really meaningful, I think, about this project and all of the awardees who are Creative Capital awardees is they're not selected by a handful of tastemakers within the organization, but they're actually selected by diverse cultural producers, experts, and artists across the country every year.
Wow, yeah.
So you're really, when you get the Creative Capital Award as an artist, you're really getting an award from a number of people around the country, which is really exciting. And it's an award of your peers, basically, because it's every other artist who's applied that year, you were selected. So a lot of the awards in this art space of grant making, a lot of them are by nomination, and it's a closed process.
I see.
So if I don't nominate you, Yoshino, like you wouldn't get the award, but it would be dependent on your relationship with the establishment.
Yeah, I understand.
And
so there's certain biases.
Yeah.
Potentially.
So that's why I think Samora's project stood out, is it stood out to people around the country who are seeing a lot of different ideas. And this was a project that really, stood out.
Wow. Yeah, that's really cool. And so has it changed the amount of people that you fund? I think it was 50. Right? 50.
Yeah, it was 35 grants a year when I joined.
That's
and
right.
We increased it to 50, which is a huge increase.
Totally, yeah.
And the reason we did that is because there's such a huge need in this country. So we are one of the last open call national multidisciplinary funders. Mm-hmm. There are national grant makers for art, visual art, there's national grant makers for film, etc. But we fund everything, and we're one of the few that is open, meaning an individual can just apply. Yeah. They don't have to know me. They don't have to know my staff. They don't have to have a letter of recommendation. They can just submit. So it's a way of enabling individual artists around the country to be seen. Yeah. So it's also about giving every artist a chance to be seen by an expert. That's great. That's part of our democratic grant making process.
Wow. Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah, it seems like Creative Capital has really put their intentions on like so many different aspects of what an artist would need help with, in terms of financially and also like, taxes and or whatever it could be, and it seems like such an incredible resource. And for artists that are listening, they should apply, right?
Yeah, they can apply.
Yeah.
And for anyone who's listening who wants to support artists, this is a great organization where you can make a tax-deductible donation. So one of the unusual things about Creative Capital is we're a grant maker with no endowment. So one of the reasons we don't have an endowment was that when we were founded, the founders really wanted the dollars to go out the door to the artists and get the money directly into the hands of artists. So a lot of times when you have an endowment, you spend a lot of time and energy stockpiling the cash. And so we wanted to spend our time and energy dispersing the cash to artists. So one of the things that I think people don't know is by supporting Creative Capital, you can support hundreds of artists, thousands of artists across the country, just by enabling an open call process to exist and enabling artists to have their ideas seen every year. That's really valuable. But then also to fund new ideas that maybe other people aren't interested in funding. And then later on, they become these incredible well-known artists. One artist that fits the bill for that would be Simone Lee. We funded Simone Lee in 2012, and Simone Lee was the first Black woman to represent the U.S. at the Venice Biennial. But Creative Capital funded her 10 years ago. So, fairly early in Simone's career.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I think like by giving these important artists that jumping off point to create the momentum, I think is super, super important. I mean, just like anything, like having a bit of momentum, and that momentum starts to build over time is just, I mean, it's just, that's just kind of how things get accomplished, I think people need those affirmations too, from a social front and also just from an internal front,
Yeah, it's I'm just really blown away by how perceptive you are about how this organization operates. One of the great artists that we funded is Lorraine O'Grady. And Lorraine O'Grady said to me, Creative Capital understands great art takes time. And this isn't, we're not a factory. We're not giving artists $50,000 and expecting them to just churn out new artworks within the year. A lot of these projects, novels, for example, I know artists who've taken over a decade to complete their project. We have very ambitious projects that take, over a decade. Many of the projects average around 3 to 5 years to realize. But, we understand great art takes time, and these ideas are big ideas very often, and they're not going to materialize in the next 2 months. And so it's a very artist-centered way of supporting the artist. And I think one other thing that's very unique about Creative Capital is we don't just hand out the check when they get the grant. So many times an artist will actually prefer to draw down the grant over a number of years. So let's say you're working on a film and you are fundraising for a film. You might have a $300,000 or $500,000 budget, and we're awarding you $50,000.
Yeah.
But maybe you actually have all of the filming stuff secured. You actually need post-production funds. So a lot of times what an artist will do is say, I know I got the grant. I'm going to leave part of the grant at Creative Capital. And 5 years from now, when I get to editing and post-production, I'm going to draw down that funding so that I can know for sure that I've got that money to finish the project. And so what is unique about Creative Capital is that we understand that an artist needs to plan ahead in order for the project to come to life. It's not like if you give the artist all of the money year one, that's necessarily helpful, because very often that's going to get taxed.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That's really incredible. Do you have any advice out there for anyone that's listening to this, artists or otherwise? Life advice?
I have a lot of advice, actually, Yoshino. Thank you for asking me.
Okay.
I think it's very important for artists to make art. So I know there's talk of artists as entrepreneurs, artists as small business owners, artists as, all kinds of different things, right? But the most important thing about being an artist is making art. And so it's essential, I think, for the practice of being an artist to keep producing and to keep thinking and to keep experimenting. And there was an article today by a jazz musician who was talking about not resting on your laurels. So I think wherever you are in your career, whether you're starting out or you're, already very successful, I think you see with the really great artists, they continue to experiment and they continue to put it out there. That's, I think, the most valuable thing. And everything else is secondary. So I think to be an artist is really about making. And then afterwards, you can think about all the other things like running a business, starting a nonprofit, having a team, whatever it is. I think the first thing is fostering your artistic side. And And I think the other thing that's really valuable is we don't have to do so much. Like, I think there's just too much pressure on artists to do everything, to present at conferences, to travel everywhere, to make new work every week, to have like best-selling whatever things at auction and galleries. And I don't think you have to do so much. I think just do what you want to do.
I like that. Yeah. Because I think that perpetuates this sort of productivity focused mindset. And sometimes I think the best ideas can come to you by being still or having a conversation with someone, or and that could be anyone, someone on the street or some, you know what I mean? So I think like being present with oneself, there's a lot of power in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're all moving too fast, and we probably all need to slow down. But I think, artists are, because we serve artists, we see all the pressures on artists to do all kinds of things, to be everywhere, to talk to donors, to talk to, museum people, to travel, to write new papers, to publish books, and endless demands on the individual artist. And ultimately, I would say just carve out time for your practice as an artist, and everything else comes second. And I believe people succeed at what they are passionate about. And so just do what ideas you're passionate about.
Simple as that. I like it. Well, thanks for doing this.
Thanks so much, Yoshino. I really enjoyed talking to you.
And I appreciate this. I appreciate you.
Let's hang out soon.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Let's do it.
Bye.
All right, bye. Music for the podcast is by Rarebit, aka Justin Dosher Hopkins. YouTube and creative support is by Tyler Scully. Thanks so much for tuning in. See you next time.